focus on restorative justice and their jurisdiction in terms of where they fall into the intercept model. And I've asked them to keep it short because we're running late this afternoon. I know some members need to leave at 3 o'clock. And our next meeting will be on Wednesday, September 28th, not Thursday, the 29th. It will be the 28th. And we're going to do a deeper dive during that meeting on our justice centers. So some of the testimony or the deeper dive we want to do with DOC, we can do on the 28th. And I do want to spend time after DOC testifies to just go through with committee members what we've got some other items we need to deal with at our 28th meeting. So I want to spend a little bit of time, committee members talking about that. And then we just want to get an update on the DOC's staffing methods that have changed from DOC as well as from VSCA for that. So Commissioner and Derek, why don't you come on up and we'll pick up where we left off with our restorative justice model, our intercept models, how DOC plays into that.
Community crackers or? If you'd like. Good, thank you.
So welcome.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having us back. Again, for the record, my name is Nick Dimmel. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Corrections. Knowing that we're under a bit of a time crunch, we'll try to keep it short. And I want to hand this over to Derek. But before I do, I just wanted to give a couple of reflections that I had after the testimony this morning. I think there's a lot of very valid conversation about where are we now, and where had this grown up from, and is that the right way that it's set up, and should it be set up differently? And I think there's a lot of room for conversation there. I think we should entertain that and explore ways to improve the CJCs so that they can be the very best entities for the state that they can be. But I'm cautious, and I think it's worth a lot of discussion about whether that funding should be consolidated and that authority over the CJC should be consolidated. For a couple of different reasons, I think it's worth further conversation. For one, no one state agency or department owns the missions that are accomplished by the CJCs. So the Department of Corrections, for example, is not responsible for youth. We're also not responsible for diversion. That goes back to the senator's question this morning about how far in front of pre-sentenced or sentenced individuals should we get in preventing them from ever touching the correction system. And so you have those mission sets. The authorities are divided among largely three state departments or agencies. But also I think it's important that the state wants all three of those agencies, the Department of Corrections, the Department of Children and Families, and the Attorney General's office, to participate in restorative justice work. And if that money was all drawn out and put in one specific place, I think we run the risk that those departments don't necessarily participate any longer, and it's all done by one state agency or department. I think those aren't insurmountable obstacles, and we should certainly talk about ways to reform so that we can optimize the CJCs. And I'd love to participate in that conversation, but I just wanted to put some additional thoughts out there as I was thinking back on the testimony that we heard this morning. And I understand, the pressures and the concerns raised this morning, and I agree with those. So I'm excited that we'll dive into this a little deeper next time, and then I'm certain again in the session come January. So I'll hand it over to Derek from there, and appreciate it. Happy to answer any questions after his presentation.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Committee. Derek Mio-Dufnick, Community and Restorative Justice Executive with Vermont Department of Corrections. I'm aware that we want to be timely and that we will have the opportunity in concert with our community-based providers to return on the 28th. So what would be the most helpful use of the next 7 approximate minutes relative to this scope of work? I'm at your disposal.
Maybe one thing we were looking at was the sequential intercept model in terms of the referrals and how does that happen to
Great.
We know it doesn't go to court, it doesn't come from you folks for court diversion, but where DOC gets involved
Yeah.
is to the CJCs. And how does that referral work?
Yeah.
And I think the money piece of how CJCs are funded is much more complicated than we have time for today. But how do the referrals occur? And do any of the CJCs respond directly to DOC? Or once they receive their money, and you folks are off on their own? So how do the referrals work?
Sure. It might be most instructive and efficient to pull back up the chart that we had looked at a little earlier. It's titled Community-Based Restorative Justice Services Funded by AGO, CF and DOC. I'm not sure if we are tech-enabled to pull that up on the screen. Yeah, that's not one of our submissions, Rachel. Willa Farrell submitted that. That's the one, Chair Emmons. Yeah.
I want yours.
Is that visible on this? If it's helpful for our online guests, but if so, if we can just, if you want to work off your hard copies, that's great too. So you'll see in terms of how the referrals work, again, this is trying to capture this notion of sequential intercepts. That is different sort of points along a progressive continuum where interventions are made available, designed to prevent further involvement, in this case with the criminal justice system. The notion of a sequential intercept model can apply to other systems of care, like mental health, for example. But in this case, if you look on the bottom line, you'll see the funder. And so anywhere where it says DOC, our grants to CJCs include the funds for the capacity through their staffing to get referrals for services consistent with that. So the 0.0 is, in other words, just activity that's generated within the community that might benefit from a restorative intervention. And the mechanism for referrals in that case might be community members themselves or schools, activity that maybe hasn't risen to the level of even potentially criminal, but it's concerning, and a community member or a school thinks, I've got a local community justice center, and I know that they have subject matter expertise in convening processes that look at kind of conflict and how we might be able to better use a restored process. So there's essentially a self-referral mechanism, and that's why we call that 0.0, because it comes right from the community. There's really not a regulatory authority, if you will, that even has to generate a referral at that point. And I think that that's an important point to mention, because some of the original thinking that undergirded the CJCs was in fact about the capacity of communities to resolve conflict and crime at the earliest onset. And so that's been a lineage of this work. Moving on to 0.1, throughout the state, law enforcement pursuant to the state attorney in their counties procedures can make direct referrals. And we heard from John Campbell about how that looks different in different areas. But our grants and the scope of work, which was that document that Senator Lyons had picked up earlier, our grant lays out that capacity to accept referrals from law enforcement is a core deliverable. Now, if a CJC is in a county where for whatever reasons the state attorney chooses not to empower local police officers to directly refer a case without prosecutorial review, that's okay with us too. That CJC is not failing in any way to discharge their responsibilities. However, that scope of work is enabled through the grant that we provide. Chair Emmons? Question? Oh, sorry. So those referrals, again, come directly from local law enforcement. They do not have to go up to the state attorney for prosecutorial review. There's a standing agreement in place between that prosecutor and the local police departments in that county that says this universe of behaviors, you've got a CJC, we trust what they're doing, we support what they're doing, send it right to them. And that's one area where we do see some wide divergence in terms of the referral numbers. In some counties, and this I think will come as no surprise to the committee, we see a robust use of law enforcement referrals. And that's driven by the prosecutorial discretion to access these services on a pre-charge basis. Okay, I'll move on as quickly as possible to really point 3, which is now that a case has been adjudicated, in which case, obviously, they're the purview of the court. The original service that CJCs have since expanded grew from what we call reparative boards and reparative probation, whereby the court issued a probation sentence, of course, supervised by the Department of Corrections, and a condition of that sentence was to participate in a reparative board, which is comprised of community members, and work through a restorative process designed for the individual to make amends to the victim, the community, learn ways to avoid reoffense. And those referrals now can come from the court. Interestingly, they can come from the court with a probationary sentence, in which case corrections is still involved, and or they can now come directly from the court as adjudicated, but without any other supervision attached to it. So there is a provision now that allows the court to effectively sentence somebody only to a reparative board process without any additional supervision, but they are still adjudicated at that point. So that's a court-based referral. And then the last point on the sequential intercept, what we call reentry, is designed, as it sounds, to promote the reintegration of individuals who are under DOC supervision. They have long since been adjudicated. In most cases, when we're talking about reentry, they have served an incarcerated sentence and are coming out under a furlough or parole status. And as part of that reintegrative process, we apply restorative practices, and our leading model for that is COSA, or Circles of Support and Accountability, which I'm proud to say we're a national leader in quantity and quality. And we have some very strong recidivism empirical data to back up that pride. And so those referrals come directly from the local probation and parole offices in close connection with our corrections case planning process. We know who's coming out to which communities when, that hit the target population of moderate to high risk and high need, with particular criminogenic need areas around peers and leisure. Because COSAs at the end of the day are an intentional micro community of 3 volunteers who are trying to norm and generate positive relationships with people. And so they do things with them. They go places with them. They become significant people in their lives, and they then have the informal authority to hopefully impact their choices. And that pairs with the formal authority that DOC, utilizes in as compassionate a way to hopefully get better compliance with terms of condition. So directly from community, directly from police, from the courts, or from corrections are your primary referral sources. I'll leave it at that for any questions. I know we're probably at time.
Yeah, we do have some questions. Butch?
Thanks. Eric, we heard earlier when we were listening to John Campbell and others, and we talked about statewide accessibility to all the programs and whatever. And so I'm interested in point 4 in the reentry area. The DOC probation officer refers folks coming out of a correctional facility or whatever. How likely is that to be applied evenly through every PNP office statewide? There's, as you know, there's a feeling, some of us, that we have geographic justice or don't have geographic justice. I want to look at it. But is this, because it's all underneath your control, the commissioner's control, is it applied evenly from Rutland County to Wyndham to Bennington to Chittenden?
Commissioner, if you want to.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, we can pull the data and look at that. I haven't seen that but I think it'd be interesting to look at. I would suspect, though, unlike the state's attorneys that are disparate and each one is elected at a local level, all probation parole officers report to the Field Services Division of the Department of Corrections and ultimately to the commissioner. They all operate out of the same playbook. There's leadership at each one of those that meets regularly together to talk through the workload that they have and the processes that they apply. So I would expect a much flatter, more even distribution than you see county over county referrals from state's attorneys or even local law enforcement or the schools.
So is there any way to check that out? I mean, look at the offices and make sure that everybody's working out of the same playbook and applying that rules in that playbook evenly across the state?
I think we should be able to do that.
Yeah, are you, which dimension or dimensions of equity relative to referrals are you particularly referring to? Volume, utilization of the service itself, or kind of who might get referred for a
We get referred to, are we referring the same group of individuals?
Yeah.
Every PNP office to the various services necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think our analysis would probably look at risk levels.
Yep.
What we know about those individuals at the time of referral. COSA, for example, and this point was made earlier this morning, most restorative services are predicated on a willingness of the individual to participate. So when we layer in that self-determination, you may see what might appear as sort of like, why did these people get this service here and not there? Well, you'd have to drill down to the individual. I think we could probably go back and look at ways to better get at that important question. But anecdotally, having been operationally involved in all of this work for many years, we have mechanisms, including the monthly district managers meeting, casework supervisors meeting, meetings among the CJCs themselves on a monthly basis, that leave me with a high degree of confidence that we are, and we're bound under the same directive too, as per the commissioner's point. While I'm happy for us to look into that, it's always been my operational sense that if anything, our probation and parole officers are just eager to make use of this value-added commodity. And yeah.
Because you're all in the same shop, that it would happen.
Yeah.
But as comparison to the SAs, aren't. So
Yeah.
On that level, certainly it would be much easier to have a flat line. But there are, some geographic differences and different charges are coming in different places too. That might otherwise be dealt with earlier in this process or later in this process, depending on where you are.
it's something more for you to do, Derek.
Yeah, great. Well, I will say this, and I know it's time to move on. I'm thrilled that this scope of work that flows through the Department of Corrections, as well as obviously multiple other state agencies, is being attended to in this way. It's vital work. And I think the more that we can collectively understand the story of it, the more that we can recognize and build a collective impact picture of it. So that's good. Busy is good in my world because it's connected to generative services. So thank you.
Thank you.
Can I have just one quick question? On the chart that you provided about the FY18 through 22, the cases, new cases.
Oh, the big data spreadsheet. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
5-year retrospective snapshot of referrals across the primary services that we fund the CJCs to do.
So my question is this unduplicated?
Yes, those are unduplicated. So when you look at any one given service within that, say, rep panel referrals, those are going to be unique individuals from a data perspective.
Okay.
In all likelihood, because while in theory, an individual could receive more than one referral to that service in the same fiscal year, it's just generally pretty unlikely. So I guess from a granular data collection perspective, you could have one person represent two referrals to a panel in FY17, but operationally, I think it would be an insignificant percentage of that data.
And so these are referrals, not necessarily people who actually received services.
Well, I think the data goes on to actually, in this case, they're practically one and the same.
The same, okay.
Yeah, if you're referred, unless you essentially just fail to engage in that service. We do have those outcome data as well.
Okay.
For the purposes of this, we just wanted to give the demand side and how it corresponds to the supply side, which is the funding and the sort of approach that we take to build those budgets. But happy to come back with the outcome level, which you can look at percentages of cases that were, closed successfully and participation and so on. So thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Just out of curiosity, you mentioned the volunteers, and we've heard about. The
Thank you.
volunteers.
Yes.
Again, getting to the kind of geographic equity, do you have information on how they're dispersed? And can you bring that perhaps the next time?
We certainly have information on how they're dispersed across our CJCs. In other words, we have clear counts on how many DOC registered volunteers are attached to each of our community justice centers. And in fact, that's a marker of their health.
Yeah,
And it's on there.
it's on this-
Well, you have the hours. You have the number of volunteers and the hours, I
Yes.
believe, right?
Yep.
We do not, as a matter of course, collect a lot of detailed demographic information on an individual basis about those volunteers. We are capturing self-identified information about the participants, how they identify racially. But we don't have, I'd say, a nuanced picture on the demographics of our volunteers, for example, like their age or their level of education or their socioeconomic level. But we can tell you and have represented, how many. And I would like to and I thank you for flagging that. That's a major engine of productivity. If you look at the number of hours across these sites and the value that we get and the civic engagement and the trust that flows back to the Department of Corrections and by extension to the state because of our investment, there's a big efficacy loop in that sits at the heart of community justice. And I think we owe a big debt of gratitude at the end of the day to these community members across the state who step into this space. Yeah, and I hope we continue to support them robustly.
Well, the goal of restorative justice initially was for repairing the harm, and that the person who violated and created the harm would work towards those folks in the community that suffered the consequences of that harm and to work together to repair it.
Yep.
So we need to move on, but thank you. We're going to do a deeper
Great.
dive.
Look forward to it.
Yes, we just got a couple more things for the committee. One thing I really want to spend a little bit of time in is really figuring out, particularly our next meeting. I mean, we already have some things in the hopper for our next meeting. But one of the issues that we really do need to spend a little bit more time on, besides the sort of justice piece, is the interrogation issue, deceptive interrogation. This language all came from the government operations committees, not from our judiciary committee. So Ben is going to give us a really brief overview. We do need to submit some recommendation if we're going to recommend any legislation or anything. We need to do this by December 1st. So we've got to start getting our head around this. And then after this, we figure out our agenda, we're going to go to VSCA for the staffing issues. See.
Chair Emmons, Ben Novogrodsky from the Office of Legislative Counsel. So to do a brief overview of the charge on the study on deceptive and coercive methods of law enforcement interrogation. By way of background, as Chair Emmons spoke about, this came out of the Government Operations Committees. Initially, this started out as a proposed statute to prohibit confessions based on false information. It would have prohibited basically evidence of a written or oral confession, admission, or other statement made by a defendant with respect to their participation or lack of participation in an offense charge that would not be received in evidence against the defendant if such a statement was considered involuntary. There was a test for what determined the involuntariness of a statement within that statute, but during committee hearings, there was testimony basically raising concerns about the current state of the law in Vermont. There's case law that talks about a court determination for coercive techniques, what works, what doesn't, what can be prohibited. There were concerns raised about how such prohibitions could apply to juveniles, at what age there may be a dividing line drawn for a flat out prohibition on all false information, because sometimes there is testimony that sometimes false information is a useful tool for law enforcement in their interrogation. But once again, there's sort of this fine line of the use of false information and when the use of that false information becomes coercive on a defendant or someone that's subject to an interrogation. So as a result of these concerns, there's this study before the committee now, which charges it with 5 various things. 1, to consider in the study when providing false facts about evidence to a suspect during an interview conducted after the commission of a crime results in an involuntary confession or admission to the crime. 1, confessions or admissions to crimes procured by providing a defendant with false facts should be inadmissible. The appropriate age and circumstances to prohibit coercive techniques in cases involving juveniles. The use of interrogation and interviewing techniques, including the Reid technique of investigative interviews and advanced interrogation techniques by law enforcement. To highlight that a little bit, that is a technique that has been criticized in the past about perhaps using techniques that are inappropriate. And there was a question over whether or not Vermont law enforcement used it. From my recollection of the testimony in committee, that's not something that's taught in the police academy, but it doesn't necessarily mean it isn't taught by individual police departments. And then finally, any legislation initiatives or programs for the General Assembly and law enforcement to consider to improve current practices. And as Madam Chair said, that December 1st is a deadline to produce a report, if any. So there's a little bit of leeway there for the committee, given the
if any.
the substance of everything that it's dealing with.
No, if any. So in our testimony that we received, it must have been
First
in
time.
June. One thing the committee was interested in looking at was the juvenile interrogation piece. That's what we had. I've also received communication the first part of September from a policy advocate within the Innocent Project that would be willing to sort of help a little bit or talk about this situation. The person has worked with other states and can provide information as to the legal framework that has arisen around this issue, the interrogation. It goes beyond the juveniles, and its basis in the cases of wrongful conviction. So we have a person from the Innocence Project that would be willing to come in and testify, talk to us about this. So I want to put this out to the committee, what you're thinking. We have a lot of issues that we're still having the hopper for the 28th. I can lay out some of those issues if you want, or Ben?
Well, and just to, if I may, supplement, some of the witnesses that the Government Operations Committee heard were the Attorney General's office, Julio Thompson from the AG's office, Evan Meenan from the State's Attorney's office, the Commissioner of DPS, so it was Michael Shirling at the time, the current commissioner's name escapes me. I believe the ACLU also testified, the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, and I don't believe the Defender General's office testified at that time, but maybe another helpful source of information for the committee to consider.
So do you want me to list some of the other items that have been kind of circling around for the 28th as well, or do you want to figure out this one? Dick?
I just want to emphasize that I think this is a mammoth task. Interrogation techniques. We've done bills on innocence protection, particularly on photo lineups and things like that. And they require hours and hours and hours of testimony. So I think that if we were to take this up, we should just really look at the juveniles. And I would love to hear from somebody from the Innocence Project. But I really think if we try to take on the entire policy of interrogation and the use of deceptive practices, it would take hours and hours of testing.
Other folks? Lisa?
I agree with the senator, although I have to say, I'm just looking back at my notes from June that one of the things that I found, searching for the right word, interesting, I guess I'll say, is that the Reed method is still being used by local law enforcement in Vermont. But the PEACE investigative interviewing method is what the state police is using. And what is, I mean, at least from their testimony, considered to be, I don't know if it's best practice, but it's certainly better practice. So I think it's a bigger issue than we have time to delve into. I think it does require a whole lot more digging, and given that it seems like we're sort of prioritizing a couple other areas, I'm not sure that we're going to have time to do this charge, to be honest.
I think we agree with that. Butch?
I do. I agree with Teresa also, but I'd like to, if we do anything, I'd like to get the Criminal Justice Training Council, or at the very least, Director Simons in from the Police Academy. We cut them short. We didn't even hear from them the last time to understand fully what they are or are not doing.
We had Bill Sorrell, though, the chair.
You had chair of the council, but I got a panic phone call from Director Simons about a few days later. You come up and talk to me, and I did. Had an interesting conversation, so about training.
Okay, so that's going to lead into something else. The auditor's report.
Right.
About the training council.
Right.
That they want to come before us and present for 15 minutes or so their report. They want to do that on the 28th. So that's another piece of our agenda. So before we go there, are people comfortable with, for this particular interrogation piece, to just look at the juvenile piece through that lens and reach out? The person's name is Nathaniel Erb, E-R-B, public advocate at the Innocence Project, and to see if his testimony can focus just on the juvenile interrogation. Is that, and I don't know about, I would leave it at that person to testify at this point. And that may bring some parameters in terms of how we want to move forward. Okay?
Yeah, and just for the committee's knowledge too, so Michelle Childs will be the legislative counsel sort of handling this piece. And if I recall from the June meeting, I believe Julio Thompson had mentioned strictly on the juvenile piece that there are some other states that have made some progress on recent legislation. I believe it was Illinois, Oregon, and there was a third that escapes me at the moment.
Delaware, Illinois, Oregon, Utah, and now California have passed legislation, but that's to the bigger, I don't know how much of that focuses just in on juveniles.
Yeah, I think some of that is targeted juveniles, but the point of raising this is just to communicate this to Michelle, and, you know, whatever pieces of that legislation really only affect juvenile, you know, to help kind of target her work as well, if that's what the committee would like to see.
Talk to Michelle about it. Okay, so we've got that. So this is the other pieces that are percolating out there. One is the auditor's report on the training. And we said we would have some time, like 15 minutes, half an hour. Also state governments and David Demure talking about the collection of data for Justice Reinvestment 2, how to best collect it and outcomes that we're looking for to see if we're spending our money correctly and how it's being invested, if we're getting the outcomes that we want. Continued discussion on the CJCs. I know Trevor would like to bring in some of the folks directly in CJCs, like Jill Evans and a couple other people. Rachel. So we can get those names from Trevor and put that up so that we get a feel of what's actually happening with our CJCs. I know Dick has had some conversations back home about juveniles in the mental health system and not having placements for them.
I mean, we talked about this, but it would be helpful to get an update. I have a frustrated local police department and frustrated state's attorney who have had a number of violent youth involved, under 18, involved in various criminal activities, and they've been denied. Evidently Sununu is closing down, and so that's more difficult to get somebody into, and they really are stretching. And it would be good to just get an update from Commissioner Demmel and Commissioner Brown on what progress is being made. You know, we did hear testimony earlier about a 3-bed program in Windham County, but that's still hasn't even opened. So there is a great deal of frustration on the local level as we see much of the violence. I'm talking mainly about firearms and shootings. I know that Chittenden County's had a number, and I know Springfield has, and even the little town of Danby.
So another piece that was brought up was hearing a report from Act 57, which is your competency to stand trial and insanity as a defense. A lot of this is dealing with whether or not we do a forensic unit or facility. Now, they came before us to give us an update. But I'm not sure they're due to us.
2022.
But that got extended to January.
It's a January date to the legislature. This report is to us.
Right.
And the chairs, yeah.
But we had them in at our July meeting to meet that August 1st date. The August 1st date had been stretched out to January. So there's no report due to us until January. Because their report to us in July was, we can't come together with common.
Yep. I asked that because the county state's attorney is we had some cases in Rutland County, northern Rutland County, concerning a person with mental health issues, and he was actually participating in the working group and was hoping to have some resolution of this act as soon as possible. It's not going to affect the case that he's working on now, but there are other cases in the pipeline.
What's the committee thinking?
just told them I'd bring it up.
I know. I'm just wondering, would it be worth it to bring them in our October meeting to keep their feet to the fire that we're watching?
Yeah, anything we can do, I would appreciate. Frankly, I'm thinking of introducing legislation on moving forward with forensic unit, because they don't seem to be able to resolve this. I read various. It's fortunate because the problem remains existing, and we all know what, cases we're dealing with in various locations around the state. And the pressure it puts on the mental health system.
Would folks be willing to do that in October instead of September?
Sure.
Because I think our September one is pretty full. So we have the juvenile interrogation, violent youth placements, auditor training report, CSG data collection, the JR2. Also connected with that is the 1.9 million in out-of-state bed savings, and talking about that in terms of what our recommendation would be, how to split that up. And then getting some folks in with our CJCs. We've got a full meeting in September.
So on the discussion about the utilization of funding, probably that should be on every agenda until we
Yes.
reach conclusion.
Yep.
And so it can be a period, we could have discussion, maybe review of the materials we have from Ledge Council, some kind of reminding us, there you are, I look it over there. The information that we do have to be available just to help us. And then with that preliminary discussion, just to identify places where we think we might want to make a recommendation or identify an issue. So just, I think that, for me, rather than just talk about the whole ball of wax, is to really try to sort out things that we identify today or we identify next time as something to be looked at legislatively and with the administration, so we can.
About the money.
About the money.
Because we do have this document from July. That's our base.
Right, and part of the money then is all the places that we've seen, how to utilize it. And there may be some policy decisions that are embedded in that.
Well, one of the things in the diversion area and the money is I'll admit that someone else sent me an email. I know Senator Lyons also received the question is, we did legislation that tried to make state's attorneys and so forth look at cases which would be misdemeanors that are eligible for expungement and seeing if they could be turned into diversion. And it would be interesting to know how that's used statewide. And perhaps it would take a few $1,000s to some group to do a study of that, report back to the legislature. If that's not being used, then we're, that would certainly save on funding for corrections. Senator Lyons, did that pretty much incorporate?
I think that could be incorporated right into the discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there may be some other reports. We might want to, it might be.
I'm talking now the use of the 1.9.
Yeah.
Small amount.
Yeah.
Anything else for the 28th? I think we're full. And then
Just spilled over.
it will spill over into October, and in October, we'll deal with the forensic report. For that.
Yeah, and on that final point, we should probably include the JFO as well, just to identify those threads between funding and where
For
it's.
the JR2.
Exactly.
Yes.
The things we're allowed to do, too.
Okay. anything else. So let's move on to the last piece of our agenda. Going to be an update from DOC and also state employees on new staffing hours. And let's have DOC come up, explain. There's two moving pieces to this. One is dealing with an emergency situation in a facility that may have low staffing levels where they go to 12-hour shifts. And once they reach a certain level of staffing, it can switch over to, what's it called, the 50-50? Is that what it's called? Where they work 12-hour shifts for 3 days and then get 2 days off, and then work 12-hour shifts for 2 days and then get 3 days off. So how all of that transition is occurring, and what's in place now. So we want to get the overview, and then we'll have questions of the commissioner, and then we'll go to VSCA for their testimony.
Great. Thank you, Chair Emmons. And again, Nick Demmel, Commissioner of the Department of Corrections. So we have a PowerPoint that I think is being passed around, and I think we'll get it on the screen for our friends attending virtually. But before we turn to that, I just wanted to frame up the situation as it exists right now. So the testimony I'm going to give today talks about a plan that the department has executed to first stabilize, but then to make sustainable the Department of Corrections staffing situation. This is a situation that has existed for many, many years and has compounded on itself time and again, and especially during the COVID-19 pandemic and as we exit the pandemic. But I think what was clear to me in coming into this job is over time, the department had not made the meaningful changes that were necessary to fix this for the long term. We'd put stopgap solutions in here and there, and sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't. We had increased pay, but not coupled that with any other approaches. We had not increased pay and tried other things, but at the end of the day, all of those were short-term solutions and didn't have the systemic impact that we're looking for in the long run. So we'll talk about the plan in a minute, but I wanted to tell you where we were at today, just on the top line numbers. The department overall has a 21% vacancy rate amongst our staff. That's quite high, but that number is deceiving because the staff number that we're most concerned about and has the biggest impact on our system is the security staff within our facilities. Those are the individuals who day in and day out go into our prisons and execute honorably the duties that they're assigned and maintain those facilities and keep them running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. That number is at 27.4%. Now, that number is coming down a bit, and I think we'll talk about why that's happening. We have some ideas that we think have worked really well, but that is not to sugarcoat that number is astronomically high. Nearly 30% of the corrections system security staff are missing. And we need to shore that up, and we need to find other ways to build a more sustainable system for the future. I think we did that in our plan, but I wanted it to be clear that we have executed, I think, a very successful plan. But the crisis continues, and we're still in a staffing pattern that we don't want to see.
So can I stop you
Sure.
there? In working through this plan, it's my understanding that the SCA signed off on it as well. You had a signed agreement?
We do have a signed side letter agreement to the state's contract with VSCA, yes. And I can talk about that, and I think we get into some of those details in the presentation. So if we turn to the PowerPoint, the first slide that you'll see really sets the predicate for what do we need to do to fix the system. And these are 5 of the key things that we thought that the department really needed to tackle in order to make the system better. We first wanted to establish a shift schedule on a temporary basis to provide staff with the maximum amount of time away from our correctional facilities. What we heard time and again from staff and what was reflected in staff surveys over and over again is that people want to get more pay, but More importantly than that, they want time away from the prison to spend time with their families, to spend time decompressing, to recover from trauma that they experience in our facilities. And simply put, they need more work-life balance. So we set out to design a schedule that provides the maximum amount of work-life balance. If executed properly, you could take a calendar for the entire year and rip it in half. And half those days are your days at work, and half those days are your days at home. That is the maximum amount of time we could set up so that people could be away from our facilities to recover, to spend time with their families, attend their children's events, spend time with spouses and reconnecting, go out and find spouses if they don't have them. But really the focus there is achieving that balance for our staff, knowing that working in a correction system is not easy to begin with. And then we've laid on 2 years of extreme trauma through COVID-19, and even before that, the hard work that they do every day. The second thing we wanted to do was study the state's pay for staff. We believe that the staff pay is fairly on balance for our region, but we want objective data to be able to make those analysis. And so we've asked the Department of Human Resources, and they agreed, to conduct a market factor analysis, both regionally and nationally. First, beginning with security staff positions, because they're the ones that we need to solve for the most, the quickest. But then looking at all other classified positions within the Department of Corrections. And I'll say, we'd initially intended to study only security staff positions, but one of the recommendations that VSEA made to us and that we agreed to was to expand the scope of that to study the entire corrections system. We believe with that data, we can make the best informed decisions as a state going forward about how to compensate talent that works for the department. The third part, and this is I think where we have gone wrong in the past, is to create a system that invests in our staff, invests in career development, professional development, and really shows that the department cares about the individuals it works for, cares about their careers, and wants to help them progress through their career. What we know about younger generations through significant empirical data is that individuals in younger generations are not as interested in pay and benefits, but are much more interested in the impact they have on their communities and how the organizations they work for contribute to those missions and how they can feel invested in as individuals. And so we wanted to focus in on that to say, you have a very hard job here and we want you to succeed. So what does the department need to do to help you move through your career successfully? And that's coupled with the fourth point on there, and that's really attending to our staff's mental health, physical and emotional wellness, and promoting a system that people can be physically, emotionally, mentally healthy in our system, especially when you overlay the notion that trauma and violence are a part of daily life for correctional officers in a way that they aren't for most employees of the state. The final thing we need to do is move away from gut-based decision-making and start to work off of real, well-tested, evidence-based data. And so we set out to create a data and research unit that will serve the whole department, but is first focused on staff and staffing to give us a better set of data that is analyzed, that we can derive insights from and make decisions off of as leaders of the agency. And I think that effort is underway already and has proven to be extremely helpful and successful. So if we go to the next slide, the way we started this when we set out to redesign our schedules was to first ask staff, what are you feeling? What are you experiencing? What do you want? What areas should we dig in on? And then when we set out, after agreement with VSEA, we surveyed all the staff on the schedules, on the start and stop times of schedules they'd be interested in. For the facilities that were closest to having a minimum number of staff to be able to move to a 50-50 schedule right away, we asked them if they wanted to, and we set up a two-tiered approach to move them to those schedules. If the staff voted in favor, at that point, when they hit that minimum threshold, we moved the facility. And then if the staff voted no, we would wait until we were at a higher threshold of minimum staff to move the facility at that time. Of the facilities that were close to that number, they all voted yes. And so we were able to move just last Sunday 2 facilities to the 50-50 schedule already. We expect within the next couple of months, we'll be able to move 2 more, which would be 4 of the 6 facilities in the state of Vermont.
So what are the facilities now that are on the 50/50 schedule?
Right now, we have Marble Valley, which is the facility in Rutland, and we have Chittenden Regional, which is the facility in South Burlington, the women's facility. Northeast in St. Johnsbury is very close, and surprisingly to, I think, everybody involved in this project, Springfield would be the fourth one that'll move, and their staffing numbers, particularly after the next academy, look very strong.
So have those two facilities voted yet to?
St. Johnsbury did vote. Springfield has not yet voted, but we anticipate rolling out a vote for them sometime in October when we start the next class.
Okay, so that leaves Newport
And,
St. Albans.
and, yeah, Northwest.
So what is that minimum staffing level that's the trigger?
Well, it varies by facilities. As you know well, each of Vermont's facilities is very different than each of the other facilities. So we have those numbers that we can provide to you to show where the minimum thresholds are. One of the, I think, unintended consequences of this when we set out to design the new models and the new schedules was when we went in to look at the schedules that existed, there was significant inefficiency, positions that didn't need to be there, positions we were missing. And so we really sat down to design and optimize the schedule so that we have the right number of staff in a facility to maintain it. And we can measure that over different, are you at a minimum staffing level? Are you at a good staffing level, a perfect staffing level? If we were above perfect, could we do other things like additional vocational rehab or other programming that we just aren't able to do because of the staffing levels? And so we redesigned the schedules. That actually helped us to free up staff for different positions and posts and reallocated in a way that created more balance so that it was optimized really to when the facility is at its highest operating tempo, you have the most staff. When it's at its lowest operating tempo overnight, when folks are sleeping, you have the minimum number of staff needed. And then you have float swing shifts that operate so that you can cover overages or if people call out. That surprisingly was really helpful to the system, and we hadn't intended to dive into that when we set out to do it, but the result was extremely positive, and I think staff appreciated that as well because it created a little more parity for folks and balance amongst the positions that were out there, and it set up schedules that I think were certainly that allowed more time off for folks and getting away from the double shifts that folks were working, the 16 hours, which are, as we all know, just a crushing schedule to have over and over again.
So I just want to clarify the terminology in terms of what triggers the 50/50 plan. When you say minimum level, minimum staffing level, it's not, I believe, it's not when it's really low. It's when it reaches like maybe 60% staff.
Yeah.
Positions are filled, or 70% positions are filled. Then that's when it triggers the ability to go to 50/50. It's not if they were all the way down to 40%
Right.
staff. So I want some clarity there, because when we say minimum staffing level, I think what comes through everybody's mind is, oh, when they've really got a lot of vacancies, the 50/50 is going to kick in, when it's the reverse.
Right. So it's not actually based on a percentage of your total staff because each facility is different. And so there are different types of posts in each facility. And so it's really based on the number of staff that are needed on one shift to run the facility. What is that number? And then you have some leave replacement number built in and ideally a swing shift built in. And so, for example, this number is not accurate, but I could pull the right numbers. But if at Marble Valley, you said, in order to run the Marble Valley facility today on the day shift, you need 15 people and the night shift needs 10 people. And then in order to fill out the rest of the schedule for the week, you need X amount. Based on those, you would replicate that day over day, but then account for people being off schedule for holiday or for, their weekend. When you hit that minimum number, if the staff are willing to help cover additional leave replacement, they could switch. And then if you hit a threshold where you had that number plus a cushion, the system could switch that facility over. And eventually you continue to add, correct, to the 50/50. That's right. So the 50-50 schedule is, as you mentioned, Chair, it's 2 days on, 2 days off, 3 days on, 3 days off. So every employee works 7 days out of a 14-day pay period. So when you hit the number, that number, and then accounted for everybody that you have working in Marble Valley based on the number of posts you have, that's how you get that minimum number. And the reason that 12-hour shifts are preferable, in our opinion, to the 8-hour shifts is that it requires less staff to run a facility in a 24-hour period because you only have 2 shifts. Now, we want to build in swing shifts to cover additional positions, but you could run it on a minimum 2 shifts per day. The 8-hour schedule requires us to have 3 shifts a day. And that's why often when we were hitting low levels of staffing, people were getting held over for 16 hours a day, over and over and over. And it was really taxing on the staff.
So in those situations where they're not at the level of instigating or voting to go towards a 50-50, but their staffing level is so low, you needed to provide a release valve or some stability. Is that when you put in the 12-hour shifts?
Right. So originally.
This is something different than the 50-50.
Correct. There's really, well, as of Sunday, there's 2 different setups in Vermont. Prior to Sunday, there were 3. What happened in late January timeframe was the St. Johnsbury facility during the peak Omicron phase hit below its minimum number of staffing needed to run that facility. And so on an emergency basis, the department converted that facility to 12-hour shifts and then augmented it with field staff. The intention was to do that for a very short period of time. What we found, though, was that had an immediate stabilizing effect on the facility, and staff preferred that over going back to the 8-hour shifts, which was not something we had expected. We then used that as basically a seed to start understanding why was that happening, and I'll show you some of that data in a minute. That same situation occurred at Springfield this summer. They were hitting their minimum number of staff, and so we switched the Springfield facility over. While that was happening, we had started to study the St. Johnsbury experience, and that's the beginning of this plan that we came up with. And then we reached agreement with our partners at VSEA to provide additional pay and benefits and incentives to help us execute this plan. What happened on Sunday was we converted the entire system to 12-hour shifts. For the facilities that were able to go immediately to the 50-50, we moved them there. That's 2 facilities, the Marble Valley and Chittenden. We intend to move 2 others very soon. For the remaining facilities, they're on 12-hour shifts, but still on their 5-2 schedule, so 5 days on, 2 days off. Those facilities are also struggling right now, particularly northern in the Newport area, with their staffing levels. But while we were doing that, we also introduced an entirely new recruitment criteria and platform, including key recruiters at every facility. So there was a dedicated staff member recruiting in the facilities. And we'll show you in a minute, but the recruitment numbers are skyrocketing. It could be an aberration, but I think it's really the result of some dedicated work that we have put in on the recruitment side while we were working to reform the schedule and models that were in place in the facilities. So before Sunday, in early August, we began surveying staff. We let them know, we tried to be very open and clear with as much information as we could about all of the things that we're talking about here today. And then we provided them surveys so that we could get their input on what time should your schedule start? What time should it end? Would you go to the 50-50s, as I mentioned? So on those surveys, we got a 68% response rate, which is quite high for those of you who know anything about surveys, which I know very little.
Especially since it was only offered for 2 days.
It was a short, but we did reach out to everybody who was off and everybody who was on vacation and on temporary leave. And so we got a very high response rate considering, to your point, it was a very short window. Part of that was driven by our need to move schedules faster and build some new shifts and things. But in future surveys, which we intend to do regularly from now forward, we will give longer windows for survey results and try to provide more robust questioning as well. For the security staff, that was 70% response rate, so still better. And as I mentioned, the facilities that were close to the 50-50, and we gave 3 facilities the option to vote for that, all of them voted in favor of moving to the 50-50 schedule. So we bring up Northeast, and St. Johnsbury is our key example. And the reason is they've been on the 12s the longest. And so we thought their response to the 12-hour shifts in the surveys would give us the best feedback on 12-hour shifts, because other than Springfield, who had been there a couple of weeks by the time we surveyed this, nobody else had been on there for any period of time. St. Johnsbury had been on there since January. So they were surveyed and their results came back pretty interesting. They had a 79% response rate, so very high response rate. 67% voted in favor of moving the facility to the 50-50 schedule. And I think the most interesting bullet is the last one. In every satisfaction category that we surveyed on, to include staff satisfaction on their job, on compensation, on career advancement, social connection, communication, and DOC leadership, they were the highest in every category in their positive response rate. So you can look at that data broken down by each facility on the next slide. At NECC, 80% of the NECC staff agreed or strongly agreed that their schedule was predictable, which was a direct result of moving to the 12-hour shifts. We were able to stop doing the 16 hours by and large for the entire period. And 61.5% of NECC staff said that they agreed or strongly agreed that they were rarely asked to work unpredictable or last minute overtime. We didn't see those results in any other facility. Chittenden came the closest, which is, I think, kind of telling that they were also in the best staffing pattern, but far and away, the staff at NECC voted extremely favorably for this model.
When was that survey done?
This survey was done in August. Early August, to enable us to do the schedule planning and shift the models over for a September 11 start date. On the next slide, we added a couple of quotes.
It says July 27th.
Oh, okay. So yeah, very late July.
July 27th to July 29th.
The first is from a line CO at NECC. And I think the fact that he comments on finally just being able to plan his life. I mean, that was the constant feedback we got at every facility is I don't have time with my family. I don't have any time away from these facilities. I can't plan my life. I'm constantly being called in. But I put this quote up here from the assistant superintendent because St. Johnsbury went to this and they started to have more staff than they needed on a given daily basis. And so for the first time in this officer's career, they created a go home early book. And so once they hit their numbers and they feel comfortable with the staff they have in the facility, they walk around, they keep a list in order, a reverse list, and they let people out. Hey, you can go home now. That's never happened before. It meant that people routinely on a daily basis were getting sent home from the facility early because the facility was appropriately staffed. And I think that's remarkable because the alternative to this book, the flip of this is the you're getting ordered over book, which everybody hates. It's a superintendent or a SOS comes around and says, I'm sorry, you're here for 8 more. And so at St. Johnsbury, we flipped that script. So if we look at some of the successes of this plan, we were able to reach a robust agreement with our labor partners, and we could not have been more appreciative of their collaboration on that. I think the one beautiful thing about that agreement is both sides brought really interesting requests to the table. We're able to reach agreement with each other through some pretty quick negotiation and then reach an agreement that really benefits and compensates our staff for the work that they've been doing. The current academy, the academy that starts October 3rd is over 2 times larger than the average academy the Department of Corrections runs. So right now, we have 45 officers who will be attending that academy. 45. And I know that Chair Emmons has been at our graduations in the past. And we're not 45 people on that stage, right?
18.
And that's not, we haven't closed this academy yet. So there are 68 background investigations, which happens after you go through the application process, 68 that have been requested. So we could still have additional recruits in this class coming up. And those aren't from one facility. They're spread all over each facility. One of the key things that we're hearing in our recruitment is folks are signing up because of the 12-hour shifts. In addition to the pay, the benefits, and the professional development work that we've rolled out and we have been advertising fairly heavily, people are coming because of 12-hour shifts. That seems to be, I can't draw a direct correlation, but it seems to be a reflection that this plan is taking roots and is working in our recruitment efforts. And like I said, 45 is astronomical.
Can you handle that?
We can, yep. And we've done some contingency planning to make sure that whatever number we get, we'll be able to move them through because we want them now. We don't want to lose them. And we are going to execute that at whatever number comes through. But that is astronomically high. And it could be an aberration, something weird happening in the labor market. But I just heard on NPR last week that Vermont has a 2.3% unemployment rate, and that hasn't moved much. So I don't think it's outside labor forces. I think this is a direct result of the effort, the time, the thought that has been put into fixing the DOC staffing problem and really going out and pushing recruitment very hard.
What is the age spread of the new recruits and gender?
That's a good question. So we do collect demographic data right on the front end. I don't have that off the top of my head, but it's certainly something that we could get you and show you the spread that we're recruiting. By and large, we tend to recruit on the younger side. And I think that's a paradigm shift that the department has had to go through. We're not recruiting the same type of officers we recruited 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. We're moving into new generations of recruits. And so we need to adjust our recruitment strategies to meet the needs of those recruits, to include different schedules, to include professional development and career development as a front and center commitment by the department in the individual. Because we are seeing that those are the things that are getting results with those that we're recruiting. I highlighted this already, but we hope to move 2 more facilities within the next few months to the 50-50 schedule, which also we didn't think was going to be possible when we set out to do this. We thought we'd get 3, and then we'd have 3 that we'd have to work really hard at recruiting and digging in on those, but we're hoping to get 4 in the next few months. So there's still work to be done. That's on the next slide. First, we've restructured the Office of Professional Standards and Compliance, and I think the important thing here is we created a division within the Department of Corrections at the executive level that's only job is to focus on the staff experience. So that's recruitment, it's retention, it's rewards and recognition, it's professional development, it's staff wellness, and it's retirement. So basically from the minute you make contact with DOC until the minute you retire, we have an entire division dedicated to working on the experience you have in the system. And that's really us showing our staff and those who might want to join us that we are invested in them as human beings and we want them to be there. And we are going to meet them wherever they are to help them succeed in the Department of Corrections. It's something we've never done before, but it is critically important to keeping an engaged, happy, healthy workforce. And that's the workforce we want because we're going to get the most out of them. They're going to give us the best work. They're going to treat folks with dignity and respect, which is what we want. But also we want to give something back to them for the commitment, their public service. And I think we are committed to doing that on the compensation side, but we also need to be committed to doing that on the investment, the personal investment side. We're also deployed recruitment specialists to all of the 6 facilities. And so they have dedicated teams at every facility that their entire job is recruiting for that facility. That has paid off. I think we see that reflected in the recruitment data. We built the first ever data and research unit, and now we're populating that with experts who have the skills that are necessary to do that type of work and provide us the data and insights that we need to make informed decisions, as I talked about in the beginning. And then we're working on the remaining facilities to really strategize on how do we get them to that minimum staffing level so we can get them over the threshold and get those folks on a 50-50 schedule so they get time away with their family and friends outside of the facilities. So that is the work that we've done. We deployed the shift change on Sunday, September 11th, as you heard. We're tracking data on this very closely so we can identify trends and show that to you. And we'd be happy to do that on the 28th if we have any time, certainly in October. We'll be back with you all in January to do that. But it is our assessment that through partnership with our labor partners at VSEA, through a lot of time, energy, thought, evidence study, collaboration with other corrections agencies around the country, collaboration with other law enforcement agencies where this type of schedule is very prevalent. We designed a structure that we think first did stabilize in many of our places and is continuing to do that, and then will help us make a more sustainable correction system for you and for the state of Vermont. We think it's working. We're excited to see where it goes from here, but hopefully we're on that upward trajectory at this point. So I know that took a bit of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions you all have, or I can hand it over to my friend, Mr. Howard.
So I think we do have some questions, Butch, and then Cheryl.
I think you answered my question, but I want to hear it again.
Yeah.
This is great. We need to try something different, new and different and radical for Vermont. But I'm glad to hear that this is not a fresh idea within your industry. This is an idea that's tried and true nationwide in certain states. So you have some, I'm sure you talked to somebody about it before you went down this road.
Correct.
And so you have some, don't want to say backup, but somebody to reach out to if you need to.
That's right. That is absolutely right. So there are several states that have correction system on 12-hour shifts, and we engage with them through, we have a partnership through the Corrections Leaders Association, which is all the executives of corrections agencies in the United States, through the American Corrections Association, and through the National Institute of Corrections, which is part of the Justice Department. And we are able to collect information and data from them. We reached out to specific state partners about their experience and pitfalls, things that they had to work through. But it's interesting, we're clearly still in the weeds here and working through it. But we just got asked by another corrections agency to help them design their system because they watched our rollout and were impressed by how it went. I'll share, Utah is one of the states that has a 12-hour shift schedule. And so we were talking with the director of their rollout of the 12-hour shifts. And they've been on these shifts actually for a few years. And he said, staff at first, a little reticent, didn't know what to make of it. And then a few years later, they went to build a new facility. And the corrections leadership in the state of Utah had said, we're thinking about going to 8-hour shifts at this facility. And he said, it was like a mutiny. We got calls from everybody, from the union, from, the staff. Everybody was up in arms that we would depart from the 12-hour shifts because they'd really embraced how much better their life balance was as a result of that.
And this is not new in other areas of industry in the private sector. We see 8 and 12-hour, 24-hour shifts on a regular basis. So that's probably, and I think you hit the nail on the head when you're recruiting, especially young people, in my experience in another area, that they value time off way more than and time with their family way more than they value a few extra bucks.
Yeah. Now, I think there is something important to be said, though, about we need to continue to compensate people fairly for the immense work that they're doing here. And so we wanted to be very clear that our plan really does include that aspect of this too. And we want to do the study, the market factor analysis, to understand, are we right-sized or do we need to make adjustments? And with the results of that, I think we'll have some really good data to tell us where we're at, where we should go from here.
Thank you.
Cheryl?
Yes, thank you. This is really interesting, and it seems as if it's going in the right direction. My question is relating to the atmosphere within the facility, and have you had any information or collected information on how the residency inmates are responding to the changes?
We haven't done that yet. So we're entering the second phase of the Prison Research Innovation Network study at Southern State. which could give us some takeaways, be able to draw some conclusions from that. But it's a valid point. I'll tell you, we were hearing, which was a little scary to staff, that the incarcerated were very aware that staffing levels were off last year, earlier this year. And so that's something that concerns us for a variety of reasons, largely safety and security related. And so really making sure that the staff are in the right position for their own success in the facilities is key. But I think it is an area we could evaluate with the incarcerated, what they have reflections on this.
Any other questions of the commissioner? Teresa?
So I know sort of initially it sounded like this was approached to try to sort of like stop the bleeding, to try, to try to address what was obviously a very serious situation.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you're really moving towards making this more permanent, and at least based upon the feedback that you've gotten, at least at one facility so far. And is that accurate or?
Sure. So the original agreement that we have with VSEA is that this will run for 6 months. So that would put us in the March timeframe. I think the goal on both sides, but certainly my goal was to collect as much data during that period as possible from staff to understand how they feel about it. Do they like it? Do they not like it? Is there changes that need to be made? And I think our approach to this is to be nimble with them, to try to make adjustments as we go, because we're not going to get it perfect the first time. But I think we'll come back to our labor partners in the spring with that information, sit down with them and try to figure out where we go from here. I think we're seeing a lot of success in this. And so if it continues on these trend lines, that'd be the hope, I think.
Mm-hmm. And then I just want to make sure I understood correctly that you still have 4 facilities, I think, working on the 512.
So we currently have 4 facilities on the 512. That's right.
So they're working 60 hours.
They are.
Yeah. Okay.
But one of those
not okay,
facilities, St. Johnsbury, is really seeing folks being pushed back out of the facility. And some of those folks are going to Newport to assist with overtime and things. So even in the facilities that are at 60, when they really stabilize, which happens quicker than you might expect, it happened quicker than we expected, those staffing levels come back down. And that number, I mean, that's very high. We don't want folks working 60 hours unless they're volunteering. That number was higher on 8-hour shifts because you had more order overs. You had to cover 3 shifts, not 2. And so more people were getting held over because you need more people in a 24-hour period if you have the 3 8-hour shifts. So while those numbers are high, the facility, that number was higher before. And the 12-hour shifts gives us a little bit of breathing room, not a ton, but a little bit of breathing room to stabilize. And then while we push recruitment really heavily, and hopefully some of our other efforts lead to retention of current staff, that creates that long-term sustainability.
And I just want to say that I appreciate the use of data and, having that help inform your decisions and asking the employees what's working for them and what's not working for them.
Yeah. And one of the things we heard is nobody ever tells us nobody communicates with us. And so throughout this, we have tried to push as much messages as possible. We've done multiple all workforce messages. We've done a frequently asked questions sheet for everybody. We sent them the agreement with VSEA, the contract, and we're respectful of our collective bargaining rules, but as soon as we had an agreement and VSEA agreed, we were able to push out information on that too, because they deserve to be informed about what we're doing.
Senator Sears?
Yeah, has this allowed you to get staff that were in the field that have been forced back into the facilities? Is this allowing you to get them back into the field?
Yes, great question, Senator. It absolutely has done that, and we've seen a marked decrease in the amount of field resources needed to cover facilities. We do still use field resources frequently to cover hospital coverage, but we've tried to create a very equitable system where that is spread around and it rotates. And as part of our agreement with BSEA, we built in additional compensation for the times that field staff are called on to do hospital coverage and some of those non-traditional duties for them.
Thank you.
Anything else from the commissioner on this before we go to VSCA, folks? Thank you
Thank you.
for rolling this out, and thank you for giving us the update. And hopefully it still goes in the positive direction that you've been testifying to.
That's right.
Oh,
Thank you, guys.
Steve Howard from VSCA, welcome.
Thank you.
And we did, I think it came through as well that we opened this up for any members of the VSCA that would be willing to testify too.
Yes, and it won't surprise you that most of them are working. We did hear from a number of spouses and children, family members of COs who would at some point like to be heard about the 12-hour shifts.
The spouses or the COs themselves, or?
The spouses, the family members of the DOC employees who would just like to share with you what the impacts really are on their families. Let me just start by saying I come to this to testify today, having just completed a tour of the facilities and a great number of the P&P offices. And we represent the workers on the front lines. They come to us, tell us what their views are and what they would like their union to say to you. We consulted with them before coming today to testify. We are hopeful that the agreement that we reached with the administration will have some impact. We are skeptical. The most important part of that agreement was the investment in wages and benefits, because that is the critical component to solving this problem. Changing the schedule will not solve this problem. And I just want to say that having just come from the facilities and from the field offices, the world that we see that was just presented to you is not the world that I saw on the ground, sitting in the break room, talking to correctional officers. We do see some promising signs in some of the smaller facilities. I think in St. Johnsbury, a change in leadership there really helped. In the women's facility, I think there's definitely a noticeable change. But there is a serious crisis in the larger facilities in Newport and in Southern State in particular. Desperate calls in the middle of the night from COs, text messages from Northwest, just text messages in the middle of the night that say, help us, help us. We're losing staff every single day. So the world that you were just presented is not the world that I just saw, or what I see in the middle of the night from text messages from our members. And that is probably the underlying problem we have in this department. The disconnect between what's happening in the facilities and what's happening in the field and what central office sees. It's a major component of why we can recruit a lot of people to work for the Department of Corrections, but we can't retain them. It's a serious issue. So let me just start by saying we are hopeful that this agreement will work. It is a temporary agreement. It does have to come back to the bargaining table. But I want to just begin with leaving you with the absolute impression that VSEA believes that these schedules will only work if we have the staff to make them work. And the biggest challenge the department has had is keeping people on staff. That's going to require a significant investment in wages and benefits, and it's going to require a very serious change in the management culture of the department. You've heard us say that for almost 5 years now. We'll keep saying that until really we experience that. Our members on the ground repeat that consistently to us. So I just want to make sure that's very clear. And I do want to say that there are people who do support 12-hour shifts. There's no doubt about that. Our members of the VSEA support 12-hour shifts. But overwhelmingly, what we heard are concerns about 12-hour shifts. First of all, what people said to us is 12-hour shifts are not really happening. There are really 16-hour shifts, because the 12-hour shifts, the overtime is still occurring, and people who are on 12-hour shifts are having to stay over for 4 more hours. So they're working 16-hour shifts. And they wanted us to be very clear with you about that while the plan says 12 hours, the reality is it's 16 hours. 16 hours in a very difficult work environment. So that was a very major thing that we heard from our folks. And I'm glad the commissioner did mention the effect it has on family, because you do hear from the folks and from their spouses. And just this morning I heard from a teenager who called me about the fact that they never see their father. This is the biggest thing you will hear from people who work these long shifts, that it's destroying their family, it's ruining their social life, it's pressuring their spouses, putting more pressure on their spouses than ever before. They're missing their kids' events over and over and over again. They tell you about that. And one problem with the 12-hour shift is that the lack of affordable and accessible childcare in the state of Vermont for 8-hour shifts is exacerbated by the fact that you can't find an 8-hour shift for safe and affordable childcare. Try finding one for 12. We have a number of single parents who work in this department who struggle day in and day out to figure out what to do with their kids, where they're going to put their kids. When you hear that consistently over and over again throughout the system. We also heard from staff that they are exhausted, that the 12-hour shifts have an even more pronounced impact on our older staff who are really tired. And really a lot of concerns about the fact that people feel that the 12-hour shifts have already cost very senior experienced staff to leave. In Southern State alone, they were able to identify 9 people who left early, because they don't want to work 12-hour shifts. And they talked to me about other folks who are planning to retire earlier than they would have because of the 12-hour shifts. So 12-hour shifts are not a gift to the workers in corrections. It is not a solution to the problem. It is potentially has part of the solution to it, but it's not going to work unless we increase the pay and the benefits that are going to these folks. And what was overwhelming to me is people said you have to be competitive with correctional employers in the region and across the country, but you also have to be competitive with the current labor market, because people will earn less to not have to go into an environment where they don't feel supported by the management. Heard a lot about that. We heard a lot from staff that said there are really good managers in the Department of Corrections, many of whom who will not take jobs in central office because of what they perceive to be the problems of the culture in central office. Central office has got to be examined. It's got to be reformed. It's got to be changed. One of the things I heard consistently in the midst of this crisis, which is still burning out of control, particularly in those larger facilities and in the field in Southern Vermont, go sit in a probation and parole office in Southern Vermont right now. You will get an earful about having to be on standby day after day, about having no time off, about having to cover shifts in the hospitals and about having to cover shifts in the facilities, and knowing that some of those folks have never been trained to be in a correctional facility. Never worked in a correctional facility. And meanwhile, there are managers working in central office who came from a correctional facility, who were trained by the taxpayers, paid for by the taxpayers of the state of Vermont to work in a correctional facility. And 2 commissioners now will not assign those workers to come help in the midst of a crisis. It really is a prime example of what annoys our members to the greatest extent possible. They feel that there is no help coming from the folks who are in Waterbury and who are supposed to be there when they need them. You hear it consistently across the board, but you particularly hear it in Southern Vermont, where because of the nature of the population at Southern State, hospitalization of inmates is extremely high. And it is really, really hurting our morale in the field. And what they said is, look, I planned my life around working a 5-day week. I knew I would have some standby. I knew there would be some coverage I'd have to do, but this is destroying the life that I planned. And all I'm asking is that I get the days off, that I get my days off, because right now they don't have days off. And that is really, I think, a very difficult thing for them as well. We have got to do something, not just in corrections, but particularly in corrections across state government, to better support the mental health of our state employees. The infrastructure that's in place now to support our state employees who are experiencing trauma every single day because of the work that they're doing is woefully inadequate. And we heard it time and time again in our visits to the facilities. I can tell you that in the last 6 months, I know of 2 state employees who took their own life who were exposed to this kind of trauma that we're seeing out there in the world. We have got to build the infrastructure to help these folks cope with the mental health challenges that they face. And I know the commissioner mentioned it in his testimony, and I appreciate it because it is, you hear it everywhere you go, not just in corrections, in DCF, all across the board. We've got to do a better job with that. And then finally, I just want to mention the field. I did talk to you a little bit about what's going on there, but they're having a really hard time because they are expected to do the job that they were hired to do in probation and parole, cover hospitals, cover overtime shifts. And they said to me consistently that they're having a more and more difficult time with the population that they're supervising. That the ability to get folks back into facilities who they think should be in facilities is more challenging than it's ever been. And so by the time it comes to a point where the offender has to be sent back to a facility, they're experiencing more volatile, more violent interactions with that individual. So they actually said, invite the legislators to come along with us. Come out to see what we see. Come out to see what's happening out in the community. They said to me, the public safety is at risk. And we have got to do something about that to keep our communities safer. And the first and foremost solution to this problem is to get them back doing the jobs, supervising the community that they were hired to do, and not having to backfill because of the lack of staff in the facilities. Although they are really understand their need to be in the facilities and to be at the hospitals, it's really wearing thin at the moment because of the volume that they're experiencing. I think I will just say that we're still in some serious trouble here. We're in some serious trouble here. And it's going to take some big, bold actions. Potentially this agreement that we have now is a first step, a down payment on what we need to do. But we've got to get out of this incremental 6-month agreement status and into something that is more permanent. And so the market factor adjustment, which we've been suggesting for years now, I'm grateful that's finally happening, may be something that will lead in that direction. But you've heard me say this before, I'm going to say it again. You won't get the correctional system you want or Vermonters deserve without a significant investment of public dollars. It is going to cost you more to get the correctional system you want. And I think that's an important thing to remember. We're not going to save money by reforming the criminal justice system. We are going to have to invest more to get the outcomes that we want and should seek. And I just want to put that on legislators' minds because it's not going to be cheap. It's going to cost more. And in particular, the best place where VSEA believes and our members believe you can invest is in the pay and the benefits and in the working environment of the members who are on the front lines in that system. They are remarkable men and women who have given up so much to keep the system together. Really unbelievable. And I'd urge you, if you can, don't tell the management you're coming. Show up in a correctional facility, walk in unannounced, say you want to sit in the break room. I'm going to tell you, you're going to see a world that you're going to hear from folks, something you probably won't hear in this building ever, but you'll learn an awful lot and you'll see what great men and women we have working in our department. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
So I want some clarity here when you talk about the 12-hour shifts. Are you talking about the 12-hour shift, 5 days on, 2 days off? Or are you talking about the 50-50 model where you work 2 days off, work 3 days off? Which 12-hour shifts are you talking about? And which 12-hour shifts are the spouses and family members talking about?
They're concerned.
There's a big
Sure.
difference.
No, I'm glad you asked that question. They are concerned about the both, really. There's a lot of skepticism that the department will ever be able to maintain the 2-2-3 schedule. They just don't believe it.
But what ones right now are they focused on for the 12-hour shifts?
They're focused on the impact of the 12 and 16-hour shifts they're working now.
5 days on and 2 days off.
Right.
Are you also hearing from family members and correctional officers in the 2 facilities that have gone to the 50-50, where it's 3 days on, 3 days off, 2 days on, 2 days off, 12-hour shifts?
We are hearing from them. We're hearing some dissatisfaction with disruption in the schedules. There are a lot of.
It's a change.
Well, right. There's a lot of people, for instance, who have worked for a long time for the Department of Corrections who for many years always had 2 days off in the middle of the week and then finally earned enough seniority that they would have at least one weekend day off so they could be with their family. This schedule disrupts that for many of them. So they're back to having the 2 days in the middle of the week when nobody's home off and they're really sort of annoyed. That's the first thing that I think that's the thing I hear the most about from people. And besides just the feeling that we need to have enough staff to get back to 8-hour shifts. The 12-hour shifts are preferable to the constant 16-hour shifts that you heard the commissioner talk about. So when you put it in that context, people are saying, yeah, 12 hours are great because it's better than 16 hours. But what they really want is 8 hours. And there was a time.
8 hours. And
well, with no mandatory overtime. There's always going to be overtime. But, and people do like overtime when it's not massive amounts and it's not forced. There was a time when I know I'm getting old, but I started this job 10 years ago. And the problem 10 years ago was that we had too many temps lining up to be correctional officers. And all the positions were filled. And there wasn't enough overtime. And there were 8-hour shifts then. That's what people want to get back to.
so I have another question. In terms of, you were talking about the issue is really retention and to invest in the employees once they've been hired. So I'm looking at the proposed plan that VSEA has agreed to in the side letter. It's temporary until March. But maybe if you could delve a little deeper in terms of what you would like, explain more how that could be carried out. In terms of, part of the plan is to build a system where there's an investment in professional development of the staff. What do you see in that investment? And also promoting and supporting staff wellness, be it their physical, mental health, and emotional health. What are some initiatives there that you see within those 2 bullet points of helping in the retention from the correctional officer's viewpoint?
Well, first of all, our starting pay has got to be massively increased.
Right, and there's a study occurring with other states to see where that compensation level is. There was an increase in compensation and in benefits, and you were put into your own retirement system. So that's been addressed. Granted, the compensation and benefits is until March, but talking about supporting the correctional officers in terms of their mental health, in terms of their professional development, what specific initiatives would you like to see?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned retirement because we were grateful to get Group G on the books. It is not the same as Group C. So the contribution rate is much higher for one set of law enforcement officers versus this set of law enforcement officers. So we need to equalize the contribution rates. But what VSEA sought and will continue to seek in future legislatures and in future administrations is, rather than the retirement rule of 20 years at age 55, that we would get a retirement benefit of 20 years. Once you've done your 20 years, you are able to retire with full retirement. That will attract people who will make corrections a career. And you want that, because one of the things that really alarmed me about what I heard, in particular in Southern State, but I've heard in other facilities, is how much experience is walking out the door. And, you know, we get into trouble in facilities when we don't have folks who have seen it all before and who know how to handle situations in a way that less experienced staff just haven't had a chance to do. So I'm concerned about that. The other thing I would say is, so improving the pay, improving the retirement. Maybe as a state, we have to tackle this, but particularly as a state government and particularly in these 24/7 facilities, the mental health hospital is the same situation, the PSAPs. Childcare, childcare, childcare. You're hearing it in the private sector too. But these jobs take so much out of the families of the people. The family, it's like what, you know, we've heard often that when we send our armed forces overseas, the families go with them in many ways. They serve alongside them. That's true in the correctional facilities. That's true in DCF. That's true in the PSAPs. We've got to invest in childcare, and we've got to look at that as an issue that is, I hear it over and over again from parents who just don't know what to do. And 12 hours is making that more complicated because there are no childcare facilities that will do 12 hours. So that's an issue I think that we're going to have to look at. I honestly think we have got to break up. I think we've got to get folks who are working in central office out into the facilities and not just into the superintendent's office, and then back out to the parking lot. They have got to get into these facilities. They've got to work alongside the people who are working with the incarcerated population. They've got to see what the impacts of their mandates are. And they have to send the message to the folks in the field and in these facilities that they are part of one team. So I mentioned the issue of the managers who have not been assigned to help in this crisis. And I don't want to blame Commissioner Demo because this is like the third or fourth commissioner I brought this up to. And every one of them giving me the same answer. It's not just that we need the help. We actually need the bodies to be sitting at a hospital so that a P&P officer doesn't have to do it. It's that they want to know that we are actually one team. That there isn't just the team out in the field and the folks up in the air-conditioned offices in Waterbury. That has got to be broken down. That has got to be addressed. There's just no way around it. I don't know how else to say it. I don't know that I have all the answers to it, but I'm going to tell you, it comes up in every single conversation I have with people. I will say, you know, there are some folks who say, well, I don't know if I like these 12-hour shifts, but the commissioner is at least trying. I will say that. You do hear that. And that's positive. But the feeling that central office doesn't know what's happening in the field and mostly doesn't care is what you hear over and over and over again. Over and over again, I heard we need to clean house in central office. I don't know how else to put it. I don't mean to bring bad news to you, but I have to report honestly what people have said to me. And they say it so much that it would be irresponsible for me not to repeat it to you.
Teresa?
I appreciate you bringing employee perspective here. And I guess I just want to be, I guess what I would call fair for the record. I didn't hear Commissioner Demmel say, well, everything's all hunky-dory and, you know, looking at rose-colored glasses. You know, what I heard was with the 12-hour shifts in this one facility, there was higher job satisfaction than there was in any of the other facilities. I mean, so I think, to be fair, I think it needs to be said that he also said these other 5 facilities show a much less job satisfaction in these areas that he spoke about than this one particular facility, where this sort of experiment is actively going on. So it's not to reduce what you said in terms of what employees are saying. I felt like you sort of mischaracterized a little bit what I heard the commissioner say.
Sure. I mean, I think the thing is that, and potentially we have completely different experiences, and maybe what people say to me is different than what they would say to him. But I just left some of these facilities thinking, oh my God, I don't know how to get out. What do we do about this crisis? The level of intensity and anguish that you experience from these facilities needs to be shared because it is not going well. And we are not right now headed in the right direction. There is some potential that maybe we can see some increased investment in wages and benefits and some changes in managerial style that will improve the situation. But and there are facilities where you walk in and you notice the difference, St. Johnsbury being one of them. And I have to say that some of that's personnel changes that have occurred there. Some of that is the shifts. Women's facilities slightly better, but when you walk into these facilities, you can feel the energy that's happening there. So it's potential that we just see completely different things, or people are sharing different experiences with us than they are with the management.
All I was saying was I think that he was saying similar things to what you were saying, in terms of at least those other 5 facilities.
I just don't want people to be left.
It's not in the same, not necessarily with the same emotion that you have heard from people.
Yeah, I think I just don't want people to be left with the impression that we're not in a serious crisis, and that all's well and we're moving ahead. That is not where we are.
Yeah.
Our members would be furious with me if I were to leave this room without correcting that for you.
I don't think we have that rose-colored glasses on.
Good.
Do we have another question, Senator Sears?
Yeah, and I'll be brief, Steve, given the hour. I would like to have a conversation with you and the commissioner, either separately or together, about the field services, because it is an important piece of the pie, and we're running short of time. And if any other members want to join in that conversation, preferably together, both of you, to talk about that crisis, because justice reinvestment really depends on a robust field offices to do the supervision. And it does scare me a little bit when I hear that isn't able to be happening. I will just make one brief comment about the disconnect between central office and the field and the institutions. I've been involved with corrections since, well, I won't even give you the date, but a long time. And there's always been that disconnect. Whether we're at a crisis state or not, I don't know. But there's always been a disconnect, and I don't know how to solve that problem. Back in the 70s, I can remember when my first working in corrections or correction-related programs, it was always that disconnect.
Yeah. And I appreciate that, Senator. And I, as I said, and I'll repeat, I don't know that I know the answer or that our members even know the answer, but what you do hear and what you do sense over and over again, it's not just that they aren't communicated with, they aren't consulted with, which can be fixed. It's the notion that I found the most alarming, that people would say to me, it's that they don't feel the management cares about them. And that's a problem.
Leave a few in the commissioner and let other people know if they want to join in. I'd really appreciate a conversation with both of you about that.
I'd be happy to do that.
That would be a good next step. And maybe when that does get set up, you just let members here of the Justice Oversight Committee know.
I can go through Peggy. She can
Go through what?
Peggy.
Peggy?
go
Okay.
through Peggy and ask her to give a Teams meeting, or I might have to be team and not Zoom, but whatever Steve and the commissioner can set up. I'd appreciate being together because it'd be easier to have that conversation.
Yes, it would be. We have to be careful as well. Once we hit a quorum, we'd be having a regular meeting.
Yeah, I know.
We just need to, and then whatever occurs in that conversation should be related to the committee as a whole at one of our meetings. I mean, in October.
Yeah, I didn't think we wanted to be around here until 5 o'clock, and I think it's.
No, I don't think anyone would. But we'll have further conversations on this, and I think it's a good point in looking at the field offices and the pressures that they are under. Not only filling in the gap of correctional officers and low staff, but also the folks that they are monitoring and supervising in the community are very difficult compared to maybe where they were 10 or 15 years ago. There's a different skill set that may be needed, different security levels, different situations now that are occurring.
I really think justice reinvestment requires us to have a good field staffing to supervise these individuals. Actually lower recidivism.
And we need to support those the staff members for that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the.
Anything else for folks? It's been a long day. Thank you, Steve,
Thank you.
for that. So we will work, Ben and myself, Beck and Peggy will work on an agenda for our 28th meeting. It's going to be another full meeting. And we will get that out to folks as soon as we can. Might not be for another 10 days because it does take time to line people up. Anything else?
For putting up with me remotely today. So didn't plan it this way.
No, it was at the last minute things changed, but hopefully next 2 weeks from now, Dick, hopefully you'll be able to make it up. Just think, you didn't have to do a 6-hour drive today, round trip.